The late afternoon sun began its descent, casting elongated shadows that stretched languidly across the city streets. Officer Mark Tatum and his rookie partner Ryan McCabe were cruising through the downtown area in their patrol car. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was quiet and subdued, reflecting the calmness of the day. It was a tranquil afternoon, marked by an unusual stillness that was rare in their line of work, a rarity that often left officers like Mark and Ryan scanning their surroundings with heightened vigilance, hoping for something to break the monotony of their routine patrol. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. For Mark Tatum, however, these quiet periods were often anything but peaceful. With over a decade of service on the force, Mark had accumulated a reputation that extended beyond the accolades of a seasoned officer. His reputation, while outwardly impeccable, was marred by an underlying current of quiet malice. Colleagues and subordinates alike were aware of Mark's propensity for aggression, especially when it came to interactions with people of color. Despite his record being free of formal complaints or disciplinary actions, the reality of his conduct was another story, a story marked by biases and a troubling tendency towards undue harshness. Ryan McCabe, on the other hand, was a stark contrast to his partner. Freshly graduated from the academy and eager to make a positive impact, Ryan had been assigned to Mark for his field training. His enthusiasm and idealism, however, were constantly at odds with the harsh realities he encountered on the streets. As they patrolled Main Street, Ryan's eyes took in the everyday scenes of city life, trying to reconcile the ideals he had learned with the more complex and often disheartening realities of law enforcement. As they meandered through the bustling city streets, Mark's gaze was sharp and discerning. His attention was abruptly drawn to a sleek black sedan that was pulling out of a parking lot. The driver, a well-dressed black man in his late 40s, was winding down after a long day at work, heading home with the calm demeanor of someone ready to enjoy a well-earned evening of relaxation. Yet for Mark, the sight of the sedan and its driver triggered an unsettling response. His fingers tightened reflexively around the steering wheel, a manifestation of his growing unease and the prejudices that had a way of surfacing during these quieter periods. In a tone laced with barely concealed disdain, Mark muttered, "Let's pull him over." His voice was thick with an undercurrent of bias, reflecting the prejudiced assumptions that had begun to cloud his judgment. Ryan, still grappling with the complex realities of policing, glanced nervously at his partner, sensing the shift in the atmosphere but unsure of how to respond to the unfolding situation. Ryan glanced over, clearly puzzled. "What's the reason for this?" "He hasn't done anything wrong," he said, his confusion evident. Mark shot him a look that brooked no argument. The silent command in his gaze made it clear that the matter was non-negotiable. "Trust me, kid. Just pull him over," Mark said with an edge of finality in his voice. With visible reluctance, Ryan activated the siren, and the patrol car's lights began to flash in rhythmic bursts of red and blue. The black sedan ahead slowed and gradually maneuvered to the curb, coming to a stop. The driver of the sedan, a man named David Harrison, displayed an outward calmness. He turned off the engine and rested his hands on the steering wheel, waiting for the officers. Despite his previous experiences of being pulled over, which were numerous and routine, something about this situation felt distinctly unsettling. The aggressive approach of the patrol car and the sharpness of its flashing lights had stirred a sense of discomfort within him. Mark and Ryan stepped out of the patrol car, Mark taking the lead with an authoritative stride. As they approached the sedan, Mark's demeanor was rigid and controlled, his hand hovering near his holstered gun, a sign of the seriousness he intended to convey. David, maintaining his composure, rolled down the window and met Mark's gaze. His face was a mask of calmness, though a layer of caution was evident beneath his expression. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" David inquired, his voice even and polite. Mark did not acknowledge the greeting. Instead, he curtly demanded license and registration. His tone was brusque, devoid of the usual pleasantries. David handed over his documents without further comment, his movements precise and deliberate. Mark scrutinized the papers with a critical eye, while Ryan observed the interaction with growing curiosity. He noticed David's name boldly printed as David Harrison. The name rang a faint bell in Ryan's mind, though he couldn't quite place it. Mark's scrutiny of the documents intensified, and Ryan saw Mark's eyes narrow slightly as a smirk of recognition, or perhaps disdain, curled at the edges of his lips. "So Harrison," Mark began, his voice laced with a barely concealed disdain, "you from around here?" "Yes, officer. I live just a few blocks away," David responded evenly, his tone remaining composed. Mark returned the documents to David with a stern expression, unyielding. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Mark asked sharply. David shook his head, genuinely perplexed. "No, officer, I don't." Mark's response was clipped. "Your tail light is out," he stated flatly. Ryan glanced at the sedan, unable to spot any obvious issue with the vehicle when they had initially stopped it. As Ryan began to voice his observation, Mark's warning glance silenced him, a clear signal to hold his tongue. "You'd better get that fixed before it causes any trouble," Mark advised, his tone carrying an underlying threat. David nodded in agreement, his expression unchanging. "I'll take care of it, officer." "Thank you for letting me know," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension of the encounter. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Mark leaned in closer, their faces nearly touching, his eyes piercing into David's with an intensity that seemed almost tangible. "You sure you're not hiding something from us? Because if there's anything you're concealing, now is the time to confess," he demanded, his voice low and edged with menace. David's eyes met Mark's with calm, unwavering resolve, his demeanor steady despite the growing tension. "I have nothing to hide," David replied firmly, his voice steady but with an undertone of quiet defiance. The atmosphere crackled with palpable tension, and Ryan could feel a tight knot forming in his stomach. This situation was far from what he had envisioned when he joined the police force. He had always been motivated by a desire to help others and make a meaningful difference in the world. However, witnessing Mark's aggressive intimidation of a man who had seemingly committed no crime left him deeply unsettled. This was not the noble pursuit he had hoped for when he signed up to protect and serve. Mark straightened up, his eyes briefly meeting Ryan's before he issued a sharp command. "Search the car," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument. Ryan's hesitance was evident as he responded. "But Mark, we don't have probable cause for that." Mark's eyes narrowed, and his voice took on a harsh edge. "Just do it," he snapped, the threat underlying his words clear. "Or do you want to find out what happens when you don't follow orders?" Ryan swallowed hard, the fear and anxiety making his heart pound heavily in his chest. He was acutely aware that this action was ethically and legally questionable, but he also knew that disobeying Mark could jeopardize his career before it had truly begun. Reluctantly, he approached the passenger side of the car, the weight of his actions bearing down on him as he began to rummage through the glove compartment. Each motion felt like a betrayal of his principles. David, still seated behind the wheel, watched silently, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He knew the issue at hand was not a mere infraction like a broken tail light. It was a demonstration of power, a display of authority being wielded inappropriately. Mark was a man who saw his badge as a means to intimidate and dominate those he deemed inferior. But David wasn't just any individual, he was a police captain, recently transferred to this precinct. Although revealing his true identity at this moment could have serious repercussions, he recognized that this was a critical juncture, a moment of reckoning not only for Mark but also for Ryan. As Ryan searched with growing discomfort, Mark circled to the driver's side once more, leaning in close to David with a sneer on his lips. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Mark taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "But I know you're kind. You're just another thug in a suit, pretending to be something you're not." David's eyes narrowed just slightly, his expression remaining composed despite the mounting tension. "Officer," he began, his voice steady and authoritative, "I suggest you watch your tone." The casual smirk that had previously adorned Mark's face swiftly dissipated, replaced by a deep-seated anger. "You don't tell me what to do, boy," Mark spat out, his voice laced with contempt. Before David could retort, Ryan's voice cut through the confrontation. "Mark, there's nothing here. The car's clean." Mark's face contorted into a mask of frustration and disappointment. He had been hoping to find something, anything that could justify his aggressive actions. Instead, he was left empty-handed, his prejudices now exposed for all to see, his authority undermined. David inhaled deeply, drawing on his inner calm as he spoke with a quiet authority that compelled Mark to take a step back. "Officer Tatum," David said, using the officer's name with deliberate precision, "I think it's time you and your partner stepped away from my vehicle." The fact that David knew Mark's name without him having introduced himself caught Mark off guard, leaving him perplexed. How could David possibly know who he was? Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together this unexpected turn of events. Mark's frustration boiled over. "You're making a big mistake," he growled, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun once again. David, unfazed, maintained his calm demeanor. "No, Officer Tatum," he replied, his voice unyielding. "The mistake was yours." With deliberate movements, David reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his badge. The gold shield glistened in the afternoon light, and as Mark's eyes fell upon the words "Police Captain" etched into the metal, his face drained of color. "Captain David Harrison," David announced, his tone steady and authoritative. "I'm your new commanding officer." Ryan's eyes widened in shock, and he quickly stepped back from the car, his face pale and visibly shaken. Mark, however, was rooted in place, his mind struggling to process the gravity of the situation. David continued, his voice measured but firm. "You've just violated multiple protocols, including conducting an unlawful search and issuing a baseless traffic stop. I suggest you reflect very carefully on your next move, Officer Tatum." As the late afternoon sun continued its descent, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the city streets, the atmosphere inside the patrol car grew increasingly tense. Officer Mark Tatum, his face flushed with a tumultuous blend of fear and anger, gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. Beside him, his rookie partner Ryan McCabe sat quietly, acutely aware of the rising tension but uncertain of how to intervene. The serene quietness of the day had abruptly shifted into a volatile storm, and Mark was at the center of it. Mark had made a grave mistake, one that now seemed to threaten not only his career but his very freedom, standing on the brink of a disaster that could unravel everything he had worked for. Mark's initial fear had transformed into a reckless surge of anger. Instead of retreating or seeking resolution, his fury drove him to make one final, desperate move that he believed might salvage his crumbling situation. The internal conflict was reflected in his face, a mask of steely resolve combined with the unmistakable signs of deep-seated anxiety. "You're lying," Mark snarled, his voice thick with malice and disbelief. His hand, previously resting on the steering wheel, now reached for the handle of his gun. The metal felt cold and unyielding, a stark contrast to the seething turmoil within him. With a swift and deliberate motion, Mark pulled his gun from its holster and aimed it directly at David's chest. The sleek black sedan, once a symbol of a long day's end for its driver, was now the focal point of a dangerous standoff. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and Ryan felt a surge of panic as he realized the depth of Mark's willingness to escalate the confrontation. David, however, remained eerily composed, his eyes, unflinching and steady, locked onto Mark's with a piercing intensity that seemed to cut through the chaos of the moment. The world around them seemed to pause as the threat of violence hung heavy in the air. David's voice, though cold and commanding, was remarkably calm. "Put the gun down, Officer Tatum. This is your last chance." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The words hung in the air like a grim ultimatum, and Mark hesitated. His mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions, fear, anger, shame, and desperation swirling together in a maelstrom. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him, and the reality of his situation began to sink in. In that critical moment of indecision, Ryan, despite his fear, found a sliver of courage. He stepped forward, placing himself directly between Mark and David. His hands were raised in a gesture that was meant to convey peace and a plea for calm. "Mark, don't do this," Ryan pleaded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's over. You need to stop before it's too late." Mark's grip on the gun tightened involuntarily, the metal digging into his palm as his anger and fear waged war within him. Yet the look in Ryan's eyes filled with a raw mixture of fear, desperation, and an earnest attempt to prevent further disaster struck a chord. Ryan was not just intervening, he was reaching out with a genuine desire to save Mark from the brink of a catastrophe. The sincerity and urgency in Ryan's eyes gave Mark pause, and for a brief, agonizing moment, he wavered. Slowly, as if each movement required a monumental effort, Mark began to lower the gun. His hands trembled visibly, reflecting the enormity of the decision he was making. Each inch of the gun's descent felt like an eternity, the weight of his earlier actions pressing down on him with increasing force. Finally, the gun was lowered, its barrel pointing harmlessly to the ground. The gesture signified not just a retreat, but a profound acknowledgement of his fallibility and the collapse of the bravado, though, that had driven him to this point. Ryan exhaled deeply, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The immediate threat had been diffused, and a wave of relief washed over him, although the gravity of the situation still lingered. David, though maintaining his calm demeanor, had an expression that remained inscrutable, his face a mask of controlled composure. He carefully stepped out of the car, his posture upright and authoritative, a silent testament to his unwavering resolve. Mark, now stripped of his earlier bravado, found himself unable to meet David's gaze. The earlier bravado and aggressive demeanor had dissipated, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The weight of his actions and the failure of his attempt to cover his tracks left him in an uncomfortable silence, a stark contrast to the tense drama that had just unfolded. The scene, once charged with potential violence, had shifted into a moment of uneasy stillness, where the implications of Mark's choices were only beginning to come to light. Officer McCabe, David said, addressing Ryan directly with a firm yet measured tone. "You did the right thing in following through, but I need to emphasize that this isn't over yet." Ryan nodded, his heart pounding heavily in his chest as he processed the weight of David's words. The realization that the repercussions of this incident would extend far beyond the immediate confrontation was sinking in. It was clear that today's events would have significant consequences, affecting not only Mark but also Ryan and the broader department. David turned his focus back to Mark, who was now standing with a visibly pale face, his eyes locked on the ground, as if seeking solace in the asphalt beneath him. "Officer Tatum." David's voice cut through the air with a resolute authority. "I'm placing you under arrest for unlawful conduct, racial profiling, and threatening a superior officer. You're required to surrender your weapon and badge immediately." Mark's head snapped up at the sound of David's arrest order, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fear. The severity of the situation hit him with full force, leaving him stunned and overwhelmed. The reality of his predicament was setting in, and with a heavy, defeated sigh, Mark slowly removed his weapon and badge. Each item seemed to carry the weight of his entire career and the gravity of his actions. As he handed them over, his movements were slow and resigned, a physical manifestation of the internal struggle he was facing. David accepted the weapon and badge with a solemn expression, his demeanor unyielding and serious. "This is a wake-up call for everyone involved," David said, his voice steady and resonant with the weight of his authority. "The behavior of one officer doesn't just reflect on them, it impacts the entire department and the trust the public places in us. Today we've seen just how destructive that can be." As additional officers arrived at the scene to escort Mark away, Ryan stood to the side, grappling with a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense of relief that the immediate crisis had been addressed, but it was tempered by a deep and unsettling dread. The events of the day had irrevocably altered the trajectory of his professional life. For David, this moment represented a critical opportunity to begin addressing and rectifying the deep-rooted issues within the department. It was a chance to confront and correct the systemic problems that had long undermined public trust and officer integrity. For Ryan, the experience was a profound and difficult lesson in the complexities of policing. It underscored the importance of personal integrity and the moral courage required to navigate the often challenging and contentious realities of law enforcement. The day provided a stark reminder of the significant impact that individual actions can have on the broader fabric of the community and the profession. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the scene, the shifting light seemed to highlight the gravity of the day's events. The afternoon's final rays painted a somber picture, a fitting backdrop to the end of a day that would leave lasting marks on all those involved. The unfolding events had set in motion a series of changes and reflections that would continue to resonate long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. Thank you for watching this video. We've explored a complex and deeply impactful scenario today, shedding light on important issues surrounding law enforcement and personal integrity. Reflecting on what we've discussed, I encourage you to consider the lessons we've learned. What insights have resonated with you? How will you apply these lessons in your own life or perspective? Please share one thing you've learned and how you plan to practice it in the comments below. If you found this video valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful discussions and insights. Thank you for being part of our community.